So we're going to give you a little bit of an introduction on how to meditate, and we're going to talk about technique. The first thing I would like to ask everybody, normally when we talk about meditation, people often have some kind of associations with it. So normally I like to ask beginning students, I'll ask them, if you could tell me in 1 or 2 words, what do you think meditation is? And people will come up with all kinds of ideas, for example, like focus, peace, concentration, presence, okay? And people often associate meditating in this kind of triangular seated posture. What if I'd like to tell you that my definition of meditation is just an unadulterated experience of your true self? So if that's the definition of meditation, then the question becomes, does it require some kind of seated posture? Seated posture is just stability and a place for us to start, for us to become better at something because we're able to handle things one at a time, so we can take the process of meditation into our everyday lives. So what we're going to do is we're going to start a little bit with this seated posture. It's kind of like, let's say, going to elementary school. You go to elementary school, you get better at one thing, for example, in a seated posture, and then you graduate and you move to junior high school, and all the way to college. So they say in Zen that you can meditate in all the 4 positions. You can do it seated, standing, lying down, or moving. So is there any time in your life in which you're not in one of those 4 postures? The answer is no. You're always in one of those 4 postures, which means that you can meditate all the time. You can have an experience of your true self, an unadulterated experience of your true self at any point in your life. So as we start to become stable, we start with kind of like grade school, elementary school. We're learning how to do seated meditation. Of course, you can do it standing, you can do it lying down, and then you can actually do it moving, and also you can do it in your life as we're relating to other people and we're just living the lives that we're supposed to lead. But the seated posture is actually the easiest, because if you're going to sit for a long period of time, if you're going to meditate for an extended period of time, seated meditation is actually the most comfortable. People say, why not lying down? Well, lying down is actually quite difficult because the mind has a tendency to wander and people can sleep quite easily and frequently. So a seated posture in the beginning is actually recommended, but any of those postures are fine. So when we're sitting here, the question becomes, what are we doing with our minds? Many people, when they come to meditation, they have different techniques that they might have been given, or they have these preconceived notions. For example, meditation is just sitting here and being with the breath. That's all true. You can just sit here and you can just be with the breath. Actually, if you practice shikantaza, which means is a practice of just sitting, you're just sitting here without any technique. And just the process of sitting and being in your true nature is the practice, is the highest expression of your true self. But if you tell beginning students to just go sit, it often becomes a process where their minds are just basically leading them in all kinds of directions, and sometimes it can feel very frustrating and not very constructive for some students, and they might give up early. So it's good to give people homework. What we're going to do is we're going to give you some basic homework, and we're going to talk about a mindfulness practice, and we're going to talk about something called labeling. So as you're seated here, what we're going to do is walk you through, and I'm going to explain how to do some basic meditation, and we're going to use a practice called labeling. So when you're seated here, as you're seated, we're also going to have you experience the breath. So experience the breath is different than focusing on the breath. So as you're sitting here, and if I were to say, let's just breathe together, it would be a process of breathing in, experience the breath going in, breathing out, and experience the breath going out. So when we do that, when you breathe in, you might feel a little tickle in your nose, the tip of your nose, as the air starts to enter your nose. You can feel the rising of your chest, and also with a nice deep breath, the rising of the lower belly as you take a breath in. And as you breathe out, you can start to feel the falling of the chest and lower belly, and you can also feel the breath leave the nose. That's the physical experience of breathing. While you're doing that, you still experience the sensation of your legs touching the ground, your butt touching the cushion. So this is physically what is happening. So as you're doing that, you're just breathing in and out. We're going to give your mind some homework. We're going to give it what we call an anchor. An anchor is a technique to bring your mind to the present, because the present is where all the good stuff happens. It's the now, the eternal now, in which we're living. but we're often avoiding with our mind being carried away and distracted with what it is. So as we're sitting here and we're breathing in and out, we're going to give you a technique. Okay, we're going to give you a labeling technique. What we're going to do is, as you're sitting here, when you breathe in, you're going to lightly, with your mind's eye, you're going to label that experience rising. Rising is rising of the chest and lower abdomen. As you breathe out, what you're going to do is label that experience falling. Falling is falling of the chest and lower abdomen as you breathe out. So you're sitting here with your hands in a comfortable posture. Right now I'm using the Maha Mudra. You can have your hands on your knees or somewhere else. Just keep them still. And you just breathe in and out, nice and comfortably, lightly labeling it rising and falling. So that's the basic technique. If I were to tell you just do that, and let's say we sat for 20, 30 minutes, what you would notice is that the mind would wander probably 100 plus times in that amount of time. So we're going to give you actually one more piece of homework. What we're going to do is, as you're breathing in, rising and falling, when your mind starts to get distracted, what we're going to have you do is we're going to have you let go of the technique of rising and falling. And then as your mind gets distracted, you're just going to notice that it's being distracted. And you're going to label that process thinking. Thinking is just the activity of the mind. Oftentimes what we do as human beings is we think that the thinking is the important part, because this is the story of our lives and it's all about us, which we are hyper concerned with. But the activity of the mind, what we're going to do is neither repress it nor chase it and fantasize with it. We're going to just observe it. We're going to label it thinking lightly with the mind 3 times. So you'll be sitting here, rising, falling, starting to get distracted. Okay, distracted. Then as you start to see the thinking come up, you just lightly label it with the mind's eye, thinking, 3 times. Then you let that thinking go. Okay? You practice letting that go, and then you return to this process of rising and falling. So let me repeat that for you. Meditation, you're sitting here, rising and falling. Mind becomes distracted. You let go of rising and falling. You see the thinking. You label it thinking 3 times. Thinking. You let that go and you return to the practice of rising and falling. So this is a little extra homework and a little extra labeling practice to give you a little bit of distance from thinking, and also to help you improve the movements of the mind. So let's think of these very simple movements. First, what are you doing when you're doing any particular action? You're just being present and you're performing a particular action. Is there ever a time in which you're not doing something? I would argue that there isn't, because you're always at least breathing. Okay? So you're just practicing being present and being observant. What happens is the content of the mind starts to come up and we start to get carried away with that content. That content takes us somewhere, or we struggle with that content. So what we do is we see that content. The first step is observing the content of the mind. Then what we do is we're doing a labeling practice to give ourselves a little bit of help, a little bit of distance from the content. And then what we do is we practice the very important part of letting go. And after let go, we return. So we're present, we observe, we let go, we return. We're present, we observe, we let go, we return. So this process is involved in every moment of our lives, throughout our lives, in everything that we do. Doesn't matter if you're in seated meditation or if you're seated and standing in front of someone and you're having a conversation. As you're sitting there in front of that person, talking to that person, thoughts will arise. And some of these thoughts are useful, you want to converse, but some of these thoughts and feelings and emotion are actually making the experience clouded. You might be nervous and tense and uncomfortable. So the first part is actually noticing that. You observe it. Okay, you can do a labeling process. We're going to give you an advanced labeling technique in the next video. But you observe it. Then you let it go and you return to being present to have that conversation with that person. So this is called, and this is the experience of us starting to actually be our true selves, which is a person who isn't overly concerned with the content of their mind in an unnecessary fashion. So the mind is a useful thing, of course. It's supposed to be used for us to understand our world and for us to be able to creatively interact with our world. We can talk about the mind. It should be something like a scalpel. So a scalpel, if you're a surgeon, what you do is you take out your scalpel and you make your incision, and then you put it back and you use your other tools. So the mind can be very sharp. If you have to do your taxes, you want your mind to be sharp, you use your mind, you do your work, and then you put your mind away. But what happens? We obsess, we get nervous about our taxes, it's tax time, and then we start to do our taxes and we're worried and we're frustrated and we have all of this resistance. And then when we do them after that fact, we're still thinking about it and obsessing about it after. So instead of being like a scalpel, we take out, we make the cut, and we put back, what it is more like is it's more like a butter knife is how we're using our minds. It has a little serrated edge to it, but we take it out and we're just flailing it indiscriminately all the time. And when we do that, we actually cut ourselves and we cut others. So the content of our mind and the obsessiveness and the emotional impact and everything that goes into that, what happens is the mind comes out and then it's used, and it's used a little indiscriminately, and it can attack another and cause pain. It can attack yourself and cause pain. But the mind is just there for us to be clear, analytical, and creative with life. And it's a wonderful tool. So this process of meditation, rising, falling, thinking, back to rising, falling. Presence, observe, let go, return. Let's repeat that over and over. The next video we're going to talk a little bit more about what we call advanced labeling. Thank you.